The wedding hall fell into complete silence. More than 400 guests sat frozen beneath glittering crystal chandeliers as the groom slowly released the bride's hand. The orchestra stopped playing. The priest lowered the wedding book. Even the photographers forgot to press their cameras. Then, from the back of the grand ballroom, a calm voice echoed through the room. "Please, don't let this wedding continue." Every head turned. Standing beside the enormous wooden doors was an elderly gardener wearing faded green work clothes stained with fresh soil. His boots were old. His hands were rough. A straw hat rested against his chest as he held it respectfully with both hands. No one recognized him. The bride did, and the moment she saw him, she laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the elegant ballroom. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." She looked around at her wealthy guests, covering her mouth as if the situation itself were entertaining. "That's just Oliver," the gardener. More laughter spread across several tables. One of her bridesmaids whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Did someone forget to lock the garden gate?" The guests chuckled. The bride folded her arms confidently. "You've spent 20 years trimming roses outside my family's estate. Since when do gardeners interrupt weddings?" Oliver didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the groom. Instead, he quietly said, "Because today, someone is about to make the biggest mistake of his life." The room instantly became silent again. The groom looked confused. The bride's smile faded for only a second before returning. "This is ridiculous." She turned toward security. "Please remove him." Two security guards began walking toward Oliver, yet strangely, the groom raised his hand. "Wait." Something about the old man's voice had unsettled him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It carried the quiet confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to gain. Oliver simply stood there, breathing slowly. Then he looked at the groom again. "I don't want your money. I don't want attention. I only want you to know one truth before you promise your life to someone." The guests exchanged nervous glances. The bride rolled her eyes dramatically. This old man has always been dramatic. But Oliver wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze remained fixed on the groom. "If I leave now, you'll never know what she did 5 years ago." A wave of whispers swept across the ballroom. The bride's face lost its color only for a moment, then she forced another smile. "He's becoming forgetful," she laughed again. "He's old. He probably mixed up one of his gardening stories." Several guests laughed with her, but not everyone. The groom noticed something strange. Oliver wasn't nervous. He wasn't trying to defend himself. He simply waited, as though he had already accepted whatever happened next. That calmness bothered him more than shouting ever could, because people telling lies usually tried too hard. This man wasn't trying at all. The groom slowly stepped away from the altar. "What truth?" The bride immediately grabbed his arm. "Daniel, ignore him. He's worked for my father forever. He probably wants money." Oliver quietly shook his head. "In 23 years, I've never asked your family for a single dollar beyond my wages." The room grew silent once more. That much was true. Many older staff members sitting near the back nodded almost unconsciously. Oliver had never complained, never argued, never asked for favors. He arrived before sunrise every morning. He left after sunset. Rain, snow, heat. It never mattered. He simply worked. Almost nobody knew where he lived. Nobody knew if he even had family. He was simply the gardener, invisible, forgotten, useful only when flowers needed blooming. Daniel looked at him carefully. For the first time, he noticed Oliver's hands, scarred, weathered, covered with tiny cuts earned over decades of honest work, hands that had built beautiful gardens, yet were treated as if they didn't belong inside beautiful buildings. Daniel spoke carefully. "What happened 5 years ago?" Before Oliver could answer, the bride stepped between them. Her smile had completely disappeared. "I think we've entertained this long enough." She turned sharply toward security. "I said remove him. The guards took another step, but something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stood from the third row, then another, 3 former house employees. One had been the family's cook, another had worked as the housekeeper, the third had driven the family for nearly 30 years. None of them spoke. They simply remained standing, quietly, watching. The silence became heavier than words. Daniel frowned. He looked from Oliver to the former employees, then back to his bride. "Why are they standing?" No one answered. For the first time that day, fear appeared in the bride's eyes, tiny, almost invisible, but Daniel saw it. Oliver took one slow breath. "I promised someone that I would never tell this story while your father was alive." Another ripple of whispers filled the ballroom. The bride's father had passed away only 3 months earlier. Oliver continued softly. "I kept that promise. But I never promised to stay silent forever." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. The bride's fingers tightened around her bouquet until several white petals fell onto the polished floor. Oliver looked toward the enormous glass windows where the wedding garden outside shimmered in the afternoon sunlight. The very garden he had spent decades creating. Every rose bush, every tree, every pathway. He had planted them all. Then he looked back at Daniel. "The woman you're about to marry wasn't always the person you think she is." No one moved, no one breathed, and just as Oliver reached into the inside pocket of his worn gardening jacket, he slowly pulled out an old, weathered envelope. Its edges were yellow with age. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were just 6 chilling words. "Open only if the wedding begins." Oliver held the faded envelope carefully, as though it contained something far more valuable than money. The ballroom was so quiet that the soft crackle of the old paper echoed through the room. Daniel stared at it. "What is that?" Oliver didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the bride, Sophia. She stood perfectly still, but her breathing had changed. Her confident smile had vanished, replaced by an expression she couldn't hide. Fear, real fear. "Don't open it," she said quickly. Her voice wasn't loud anymore, it trembled. Daniel looked at her in surprise. "Why?" She forced a laugh. "Because this is ridiculous." She stepped toward Oliver. "Give it to me." Oliver gently pulled the envelope back. "It isn't yours. It was never meant for you." Daniel frowned. "Then who wrote it?" Oliver looked down at the handwriting. "Your future father-in-law." A wave of gasps swept across the guests. Sophia's late father, the powerful businessman everyone respected. The man whose portrait still hung in the entrance of the family estate. Daniel felt his heart beat faster. "My father-in-law wrote that?" Oliver nodded slowly. "The night before he died." Sophia shook her head. "He's lying," but her voice lacked conviction. Oliver continued. "He asked me to keep this sealed. He said if the wedding never happened, I should burn it. But if this day ever came, I must place it in the groom's hands." Daniel reached out. Oliver carefully gave him the envelope for several seconds. Daniel simply stared at it. The paper was worn. The wax seal had never been broken. Even the family crest pressed into the wax matched the one engraved on the wedding invitations. It was genuine. Sophia suddenly grabbed Daniel's wrist. "Please, don't." He looked into her eyes. "This letter scares you." "It should scare both of us," she replied quickly. "It's probably another one of my father's strange tests." Oliver quietly shook his head. "No, it was his greatest regret." The words struck the room like thunder. Regret. Daniel carefully broke the old wax seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Inside was a single folded letter and a photograph. The photograph slipped onto the marble floor. Daniel bent down. His face changed instantly. It showed Sophia, 5 years younger, standing beside a small greenhouse. But she wasn't smiling. She was shouting at someone kneeling on the ground. Someone covered in dirt, Oliver. The guests leaned forward. Sophia quickly spoke. "That's only one picture. You don't know what happened." Daniel slowly unfolded the letter. His hands were trembling now. At the top it read, "To the man who may one day marry my daughter." The room seemed to stop breathing. Daniel began reading silently. His eyes moved from one line to another, then another. His expression changed. Confusion, disbelief, sadness, finally, shock. Sophia stepped closer. What does it say? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Oliver. Is this true? Oliver lowered his eyes. I wish it wasn't. Daniel swallowed hard. What happened 5 years ago? Oliver finally began. It was the hottest summer I'd ever worked. The gardens were dying. So every morning, I arrived before sunrise. His calm voice painted the memory so clearly that the ballroom seemed to disappear. I was repairing the old greenhouse. Your father came outside carrying coffee. He sat beside me. We talked for nearly an hour. It was the first time he ever asked about my family. Oliver smiled faintly. I told him I had one grandson, Ethan, my whole world. Several guests smiled softly. Oliver continued. He was 10 years old. He loved flowers. He dreamed of becoming a botanist. So every Saturday, he came to help me. Oliver paused. His eyes became distant. He was working beside me that afternoon. When Miss Sophia arrived, Sophia immediately interrupted. Stop! Oliver didn't. She had invited friends to the estate. They wanted photos beside the roses, but Ethan had left gardening tools on the pathway. It wasn't dangerous, just messy. Sophia's breathing became heavier. Oliver looked toward the floor. She became angry, very angry. Daniel listened without blinking. What happened? Oliver closed his eyes for a moment. She told Ethan. That poor children didn't belong in beautiful places. The ballroom exploded into whispers. No, someone quietly muttered. Another guest covered her mouth. Oliver continued. She picked up his backpack, the one his school had donated, and threw it into the fountain. Daniel slowly turned toward Sophia. She looked away. Oliver's voice remained calm. Ethan climbed into the water to save his books. They floated everywhere. His science notebook, his plant sketches, everything, Daniel whispered. You never told me this. Sophia answered immediately. Because it wasn't like that. Oliver didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket again. This time he removed a tiny notebook. Its cover was faded blue. Water stains covered every page. He handed it to Daniel. My grandson kept this. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside were hundreds of hand-drawn flowers, scientific names, carefully colored petals, notes written in a child's handwriting. The last pages were badly damaged by water across one page. Barely visible were 6 heartbreaking words. I hope flowers don't hate me. Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. Oliver smiled sadly. He cried for 3 days, but not because of the books. Daniel looked up. Then why? Oliver answered quietly. He believed. He had embarrassed me. The ballroom fell silent again. Even Sophia's bridesmaids lowered their heads. Oliver continued. My grandson apologized to me. Again and again. He kept saying, Grandpa, I'm sorry rich people saw me. No one laughed anymore. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. His hands were shaking. But your letter. What regret did her father have? Oliver looked toward the portrait hanging near the ballroom entrance. He witnessed everything. He said nothing, for weeks, until one evening, he knocked on my little house. Oliver's voice grew softer. He cried. It was the only time I ever saw him cry. Daniel stared at the unopened second page of the letter. There are more pages. Oliver nodded. Yes, and what's written there is the real reason this wedding cannot continue. Just then the ballroom doors opened once again. A middle-aged man wearing a dark suit stepped inside, carrying an old metal box. He walked straight toward Oliver. Without saying a word, he placed the box at Daniel's feet. Daniel looked up, confused. What is this? The stranger took a slow breath before answering. I was your future father-in-law's lawyer. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to finally open that letter. The lawyer carefully removed his leather gloves before kneeling beside the old metal box. Every guest watched in complete silence. Daniel looked from the box to Oliver. You knew this was coming, Oliver nodded. I prayed this day would never arrive. The lawyer unlocked the rusted padlock. The sharp click echoed through the ballroom. Inside were several neatly tied folders, a small wooden jewelry box, and an old video recorder. Nothing about it looked expensive. Yet the weight of the room changed instantly. The lawyer picked up the first folder. 5 years ago, Mr. Richard Whitmore asked me to prepare these documents. Daniel frowned. My future father-in-law? Yes. He believed there might come a day when the truth would matter more than protecting his family's reputation. Sophia suddenly stepped forward. Enough. Her voice cracked. My father isn't here to explain himself. The lawyer looked at her sadly. He already did. He placed a sealed envelope into Daniel's hands. Across the front, Richard had written only one sentence. If you truly love my daughter, read this with compassion, not anger. Daniel slowly opened it. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Inside was another handwritten letter. This one was much longer. He began reading aloud. To the man who stands where I once stood. If you are reading this, then I have failed. Not as a businessman, not as a father who provided wealth, but as a father who failed to teach humility. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel continued, You probably believe my daughter became this person overnight. She didn't. Every time I ignored her cruelty. Every time I excused her behavior because she was young. Every time I protected her from consequences. I helped create the woman standing beside you. Sophia lowered her eyes. Tears slowly formed, but she didn't wipe them away. Daniel kept reading. The day she humiliated Oliver's grandson, I watched from my office window. I heard every word. I saw the little boy climb into the fountain to rescue his books, and I did nothing. Oliver quietly closed his eyes. Daniel's voice became softer. That silence has haunted me every day since. The ballroom was so quiet that someone in the back could be heard crying. Daniel unfolded the second page. That evening I visited Oliver. Instead of blaming me, he offered me tea. Instead of demanding justice, he comforted me. Several guests looked toward Oliver with disbelief. Daniel continued. I asked why he wasn't angry. He answered, Because bitterness grows faster than flowers. Oliver smiled faintly. I barely remember saying that. The lawyer nodded. Mr. Whitmore never forgot. Daniel read the next lines. That old gardener taught me more in one evening than I had learned in 60 years of business. He asked me to forgive myself, before I even apologized. Many guests quietly wiped away tears. Daniel looked at Oliver. You forgave him, Oliver answered simply. He came to my home as a father, not as a rich man. Those are very different people. Daniel stared at him in amazement. Most people would have sued. Oliver gently smiled. My grandson needed healing, not revenge. A long silence followed. Then Daniel noticed something. There are still pages left. The lawyer nodded. The most important ones. Daniel continued reading. I secretly paid for Ethan's education after that day. Oliver refused every offer of money. So I found another way. Scholarships, books, science camps, anonymous donations. Oliver looked genuinely surprised. What? The lawyer smiled softly. You never knew. Oliver shook his head. No, I thought the schools were simply generous. The lawyer reached into the metal box again. He removed dozens of receipts, letters, scholarship approvals, university acceptance documents, every one of them signed anonymously. Richard Whitmore. Daniel looked at Oliver. He never told you, the lawyer answered instead. He wasn't allowed. It was Mr. Whitmore's final condition. Oliver's eyes filled with tears. For all these years, he was helping Ethan, the lawyer nodded. Every year, Daniel slowly smiled. So Ethan became a botanist. The lawyer's expression changed. No, the smile disappeared from Daniel's face. What happened? Oliver looked confused too. The lawyer took a deep breath. 3 years ago, Ethan changed his dream. Oliver frowned. He never told me that. He didn't want to disappoint you. The lawyer opened another folder. He studied medicine. The room became silent again. Daniel blinked. Medicine? Yes, he said. Grandpa spent his life growing flowers. I want to spend mine saving people. Oliver covered his mouth. His shoulders trembled. I didn't know. The lawyer smiled warmly. He still carries your gardening gloves in his apartment. They remind him where he came from. Oliver could no longer hold back his tears. Several guests quietly applauded, not loudly, just enough to honor a man who had never asked for recognition. Daniel looked towards Sophia. She stood completely motionless. Her makeup was beginning to run. The confident bride everyone had admired an hour earlier was gone. Only guilt remained. Daniel spoke gently. "Did you ever try to find Ethan?" Sophia whispered. "I looked." "When?" "The next day." Oliver looked surprised. "You did," she nodded, "but you had both disappeared." Oliver smiled sadly. "I accepted work in another town for nearly 2 years." Sophia's voice shook. "I wanted to apologize. No, I needed to." She looked around the ballroom. "But every year it became harder." "I told myself it was too late," Daniel quietly asked. "Was it?" No one answered. Then the lawyer reached for the small wooden jewelry box. "This is why your father believed the wedding should stop." Daniel slowly opened the lid. Inside was not jewelry. There was a simple silver key, and beneath it, a folded legal document. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Final Last Will and Testament." The lawyer looked directly at Daniel. "You need to read Clause 7. Daniel unfolded the page. The first sentence made his hands go completely still. "My daughter shall inherit nothing until she earns the forgiveness of the man she once believed was beneath her." No one in the ballroom dared to speak. Daniel stared at the document in his trembling hands, reading the sentence again as if hoping the words would change. "My daughter shall inherit nothing until she earns the forgiveness of the man she once believed was beneath her." He slowly lowered the paper. The silence was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. She looked toward Oliver, but for the first time in her life, she couldn't find the courage to meet his eyes. The lawyer quietly continued. "Mr. Whitmore amended his will 6 months before he passed away. He said wealth without character becomes a burden instead of a blessing." A soft murmur spread through the guests. Many of them had known Richard Whitmore as a brilliant businessman. Very few had known the regret he carried. Daniel folded the document carefully. "So, none of this was about money?" The lawyer shook his head. "No, it was about redemption." Oliver remained completely still. "I never wanted this. I never asked for her inheritance. I only wanted peace." The lawyer smiled gently. "Mr. Whitmore knew that. He also knew you would never demand anything. That's exactly why he trusted you." Sophia finally stepped forward. The expensive wedding dress that had looked so perfect an hour ago suddenly felt painfully out of place. She stopped a few feet in front of Oliver. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "May I speak?" Oliver nodded. "You never needed permission." Sophia closed her eyes. For several long seconds, she couldn't say a single word. Then, "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, broken, almost swallowed by tears. Oliver listened without interrupting. "I've practiced those words 1,000 times. I imagined finding you. I imagined explaining everything. But every year I became more ashamed." She wiped tears from her face. "So instead, I hid. I convinced myself you hated me." Oliver answered softly. "Hate is a very heavy thing to carry. I put it down a long time ago." Sophia looked up, surprised. "You forgave me?" Oliver smiled sadly. "I forgave you years ago." The entire ballroom froze. Sophia blinked. "What? I forgave you before you even asked." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "But after everything I did," Oliver nodded. "You were cruel. You hurt my grandson. You wounded a child's heart. Those things were real." He paused. "But if I had spent 5 years feeding anger, my grandson would have grown up learning bitterness instead of kindness." Daniel watched the old gardener with admiration. Oliver wasn't speaking like someone trying to win. He was speaking like someone who had already healed. Sophia slowly sank to her knees. The expensive white dress spread across the polished floor. The richest woman in the room suddenly looked like the smallest. "I'm ashamed of who I was," Oliver quietly replied. "Good." Several guests looked confused. Oliver continued, "Because shame can become the beginning of wisdom. If you let it change you." Sophia lowered her head. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Oliver gently smiled. "None of us deserve it. That's why it's called forgiveness. The words settled deeply into every heart in the room. Even the wedding staff had stopped working. Many were quietly crying. Daniel looked toward the lawyer. Is this enough? The lawyer shook his head. The will doesn't say she must apologize. It says she must earn forgiveness. Daniel frowned. What's the difference? Before the lawyer could answer, Oliver spoke first. Words are easy. Changed lives are difficult. Everyone listened carefully. You cannot erase yesterday, but you can decide who you'll become tomorrow. Sophia slowly stood. Her hands trembled. What do I have to do? Oliver looked toward the enormous windows overlooking the gardens. The roses swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. You don't owe me anything. You owe the world a better version of yourself. She stared at him. I don't understand. You hurt one little boy, but there are thousands of children carrying invisible wounds. You know what cruelty feels like now. So spend your life making sure fewer children ever experience it. The ballroom remained silent. Daniel suddenly realized Oliver wasn't asking for revenge. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for punishment. He was asking for purpose. Sophia whispered, If I dedicate my life to helping children, would that honor your grandson? Oliver smiled. It would honor your own heart. The lawyer slowly closed the metal box. I believe Mr. Whitmore hoped for exactly this. Daniel turned toward Sophia. I need to ask you something. She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. When you said you looked for Ethan, were you telling the truth? She nodded immediately. Every year, I hired investigators. I visited schools. I even returned to the old greenhouse. I just never found them. Oliver looked surprised. You came back, she nodded. Many times. I left letters. I planted flowers. I hoped one day you'd see them. Oliver thought quietly for a moment, then he smiled. The yellow tulips, Sophia's eyes widened. You saw them. I wondered who planted them. She broke into tears again. They were Ethan's favorite. Oliver looked down. He used to say yellow flowers looked like little pieces of sunshine. For the first time that afternoon, both of them smiled through their tears. Daniel quietly reached for Sophia's hand. She looked at him uncertainly. I can't marry the person you were. He paused. But maybe. I can still love the person you're choosing to become. Fresh tears filled Sophia's eyes before she could answer. The ballroom doors opened once more. A young man in a navy blue suit stepped inside. Around his neck hung a hospital identification badge. He looked no older than 25. The moment Oliver saw him, his weathered face lit up with disbelief. Ethan, the young man smiled warmly. Hi, Grandpa. Oliver stood frozen, then without caring about the hundreds of guests watching. He hurried across the ballroom and embraced his grandson. The room erupted into gentle applause. But as Ethan looked up, his eyes met Sophia's. She immediately looked away in shame. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan took one slow step toward her and quietly said, The applause slowly faded. But no one left their seat. No one reached for their phone. No one even whispered. Every eye was fixed on the young doctor standing beside the old gardener. Oliver still couldn't believe it. He held Ethan's shoulders with trembling hands, as if afraid his grandson might disappear if he let go. You're really here, Ethan smiled. I wouldn't have missed this day. Oliver shook his head, laughing through tears. I thought you were working at the hospital. I was, Ethan nodded. I came as soon as I received Grandpa Richard's lawyer's message. The lawyer smiled. Your grandfather asked me to contact Ethan only if the letter was ever opened. Daniel looked between them. So, you knew. Ethan nodded slowly. I knew there was a letter, but I never knew what was inside. His eyes finally met Sophia's. She stood silently, unable to speak. The confident bride everyone had admired that morning was gone. She looked like someone carrying 5 years of regret on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward Ethan. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she finally stood in front of him, tears streamed down her face. I'm sorry, her voice cracked. I've wanted to say those words for 5 years. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to believe I've changed. She lowered her head. I only wanted you to know that I've never forgiven myself. The ballroom remained completely silent. Ethan looked at her for several moments. Then he smiled softly. You know, when I was 10, I thought you had ruined my life. Sophia closed her eyes. I know, but something unexpected happened. She looked up. My books were destroyed. My sketches were gone. I cried for days, but my grandfather told me something I'll never forget. Oliver looked surprised. I did, Ethan laughed. You probably don't remember. You told me. Flowers bloom again after every storm, Oliver smiled. I remember now, Ethan nodded. At first I thought you were talking about roses, but years later, I realized you were talking about people. The guests listened without moving. My pain made me kinder. My loss made me stronger. My grandfather's forgiveness taught me something medical school never could. He looked directly at Sophia. If that day had never happened, I might never have become the doctor I am today. She stared at him in disbelief. What? Ethan nodded. I wanted to become a botanist, but after seeing how much emotional pain could hurt a person, I decided I wanted to heal people instead. A tear rolled down Oliver's cheek. Daniel smiled quietly. So even your greatest heartbreak became someone else's hope. Ethan nodded. It did. Sophia covered her mouth. I don't deserve your kindness. No, Ethan answered gently, but kindness isn't earned. It's given. The room fell silent once more. Oliver looked proudly at his grandson. For years he had worried that one cruel afternoon might have filled Ethan's heart with bitterness. Instead, it had filled it with compassion. The lawyer stepped forward. There is one final document. He opened the last folder from the metal box. Richard Whitmore wrote one final request. Daniel unfolded the paper. It read, If my daughter truly changes, I ask that my estate become a place of hope instead of privilege. Turn our family mansion into a foundation where children from struggling families can study, grow, and dream without fear. Let the gardens Oliver planted become gardens every child can enjoy. Sophia broke into tears again. My father, the lawyer nodded. He believed this was the only way his mistakes could become something beautiful. Daniel looked at Sophia. What do you want to do? She didn't hesitate. We'll do exactly what he asked. The guests looked at one another in surprise. She continued. The mansion doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every child who has ever been told they weren't good enough. Oliver smiled. Richard Whitmore had hoped for redemption. Now he was witnessing it through others. Months passed. The wedding that never happened became the beginning of a very different story. The Whitmore estate no longer hosted glamorous parties. Instead, its gates opened every weekend to children from shelters, orphanages, and struggling families. The ballroom became a library. The guest suites became classrooms. The greenhouse where Ethan had once been humiliated became a science center filled with microscopes, plants, and curious young minds. Outside, Oliver still cared for the gardens. But now he was never alone. Children followed him through every pathway, learning the names of flowers, planting seeds, and laughing together. Every child received a small notebook, just like the one Ethan had carried years before, only this time. No one would ever throw those dreams into a fountain. Daniel left part of his business career behind and helped manage the foundation. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He often said that the most valuable investment he had ever made wasn't in a company, it was in people. Sophia worked there every single day. She cleaned classrooms, served meals, read stories to children. She never introduced herself as the owner's daughter. She introduced herself simply as a volunteer. Some people still remembered the arrogant woman she had once been. But year after year, her actions slowly spoke louder than her past. One sunny afternoon, nearly 3 years later, a little girl walked nervously through the foundation gates holding a torn backpack. She stood quietly near the entrance, afraid to come inside. Sophia noticed her immediately. Without saying a word, she knelt beside the little girl. Then she gently picked up the worn backpack, brushed away the dust, and smiled. You belong here. Oliver watched from the garden. He smiled without saying a word. The circle had finally been broken. Years later, visitors entering the gardens would notice a simple wooden bench beneath the oldest rose tree. On a small bronze plaque were engraved the words that had quietly changed so many lives. Kindness grows where pride once stood. And beneath those words, in smaller letters, flowers bloom again after every storm. Because in the end, the wedding wasn't stopped to destroy 2 lives. It was stopped to save many more. One old gardener proved that forgiveness is stronger than revenge. One frightened little boy grew into a doctor who healed hearts as well as bodies. One wealthy family discovered that true inheritance isn't measured in money, but in the lives we lift. And one act of cruelty, met with extraordinary grace, became the seed from which thousands of new dreams would bloom. And hoping we'd meet again.